Great Demon King. Chapter 25. Pain and Happiness. Lawrence fixed Han Shuo with a perplexed stare, then broke into a slight, approving grin. "Very good," he said softly. In a single fluid motion, he vanished from his spot and reappeared right in front of Han Shuo, as if propelled by lightning. His next attack, a swift and brutal kick, once again targeted Han Shuo's already aching stomach. Han Shuo was still suffering the aftershocks of Lawrence's earlier kicks. His abdomen throbbed painfully. He felt every breath as a sharp reminder of how outmatched he was. A sergeant knight's speed and power, fueled by fighting aura, was simply far beyond that of an ordinary brawler. And yet, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Han Shuo found himself unafraid. In fact, there was a strange excitement humming through him. His demonic cultivation, aided by the circulating magical yuan inside him, continuously soothed the worst of the pain, taking the sting off just enough for him to stay clear-headed. A split second before Lawrence's foot made contact, Han Shuo sprang backward, his heels scraping against the hard ground. He narrowly avoided another devastating blow. Yet, Lawrence betrayed not a hint of surprise. He merely pressed the attack, fluidly chaining together a series of punches and kicks. Each rapid movement carried the full weight of his enhanced fighting aura, and he launched into Han Shuo with relentless ferocity. No matter how quickly Han Shuo tried to evade, Lawrence's superior speed caught up with him. His fists and feet collided with Han Shuo's body again and again, each impact accompanied by the dull, punishing sound of flesh meeting bone. Han Shuo could do little more than shield his head with crossed forearms, leaving his torso, arms, and legs woefully exposed. After each heavy strike, he'd stumble, body spasming with pain. In truth, if not for Han Shuo's months of secret cultivation and daily physical training, he would have been on the brink of death from the very first barrage of blows. The original Brian, whose body had once been fragile and malnourished, stood no chance against the raw power behind Lawrence's fighting aura. But repeated absorption of magical yuan had toughened Han Shuo's muscles and bones, allowing him to cling to consciousness through this brutal onslaught. Though just barely onslaught, his previous encounters with fighters like Claude and Eric had given him a misleading sense of what knights and warriors could do. Those two had tried injecting their fighting aura directly into Han Shuo's body, a technique that would typically wreak havoc on someone's organs. However, Han Shuo's magical yuan was able to encase and neutralize that internal attack before it turned fatal. As a result, he'd escaped what should have been certain death, leaving both Claude and Eric staggered by his apparent invulnerability. Now, though, Lawrence was using an entirely different approach. Instead of thrusting aura into Han Shuo's internal system, he channeled it into his limbs to greatly enhance his raw speed and striking power. This method forced Han Shuo to face each blow head-on, using only his physical body to absorb the hitsi. As a result, the buffering effect of his magical yuan couldn't shield him from the external trauma. Every punch and kick landed with bone-jarring impact, sapping his strength and threatening to break him. Finally, one particularly savage kick slammed into Han Shuo's midsection again. He coughed out a ragged gasp as he staggered backward, then pitched to the ground with a dull thud. His vision blurred as he tried, and failed, to get back up. His ribs felt like shattered glass, and waves of torment rippled through every muscle in his body. He could hardly move. Excruciating as it was just to breathe, he discovered an odd, paradoxical delight lurking in the midst of the agony. His magical yuan had begun circulating at an accelerated pace, rushing through his veins with such intensity, it felt almost volcanic. That smoldering heat coursed through the broken places, his cracked ribs, battered muscles, bruised skin, kindling a strange ecstasy behind the pain. Here it is, Han Shuo thought, even as his breath came in pained, ragged spurts. This is what I've been waiting for. Every vicious blow from Lawrence seemed to fan the flames of his demonic cultivation, transforming suffering into a catalyst for growth. Through gritted teeth, he let out a ragged groan that turned into a hollow, humorless laugh. Slowly, agonizingly, he forced his body off the ground, ignoring the protests of his twisted limbs and battered joints. His voice, half choked with pain, somehow carried a trace of triumph. "I think," he said in short, gasping bursts, "we can do this again sometime." Standing a few paces away, Lawrence blinked in astonishment. As a sergeant knight, he knew the force behind his last few attacks could incapacitate most fully armored knights of similar rank, let alone a thin youth wearing no protective gear and possessing no noticeable aura of his own. Yet here was Han Shuo, body trembling violently, hoisting himself upright with obvious difficulty. Even more bizarre was the twisted grin plastered on his face, as if the brutal beating had pleased him rather than driven him to defeat. The statement about wanting a long-term partnership finally registered in Lawrence's mind. He stood there for a moment, silent. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but curious. "Brian, you're a peculiar one. I'll admit, you're tougher than I expected. But whether you can keep this up depends on your body's limits. Today, I've barely scratched the surface of what I can do. I haven't even drawn my sword. However," he added, crossing his arms, "I have plenty of gold. If you want to keep earning it, feel free to come find me again. I'll pay you the same 5 gold coins each time. Do we have a deal?" Still gasping, but with eyes that shone with fierce determination, Han Shuo nodded. "Count on it," he said hoarsely. He was convinced this was the perfect way to drive his cultivation forward. More beatings meant more pain, and more pain meant more potential for a breakthrough from the solid realm. Lawrence offered a respectful tilt of his head. "Then I look forward to our next session. But be warned, my attacks will get worse each time. Don't expect any mercy." When Han Shuo simply smirked in response, Lawrence looked faintly amused. He retrieved his sword and outer garments, slipping them on without another word, and departed with brisk strides. Han Shuo didn't immediately follow him out of the training field. Instead, he dropped into a cross-legged position on the stone floor, wincing at the stab of pain that shot through him. Despite the throbbing in his ribs and arms, he closed his eyes and began guiding the flow of magical yuan through his body. Little by little, the savage ache subsided enough for him to breathe comfortably. Every circuit of magical yuan was like a blacksmith's hammer, reshaping fractured bones and shredded muscle fibers. Not that it magically healed him on the spot. He was still severely injured, but the initial, most life-threatening damage receded, replaced by a throbbing, energized feeling. Once the worst wave of agony ebbed, he pulled himself to his feet. Though each step was painful, he found that, by walking slowly and carefully, he could manage it. Somehow, the sharp adrenaline that had coursed through him was now a simmering warmth deep in his bones. He chuckled softly under his breath, marveling at the contradictory mix of torment and satisfaction that pulsed through him. Breaking truly was the quickest, if most savage, path to strengthen his cultivation. As Han Shuo exited the training field, he immediately attracted attention from others who were waiting, or had just finished sparring themselves. Some gasped at the bruises and cuts on his body. Others just stared in disbelief. One voice in particular rang out from nearby, a concerned tone cutting through the chatter. "Brian, oh gods, are you all right?" Turning gingerly, Han Shuo recognized Cal, the good-hearted warrior who had tried to warn him off earlier. Cal's own clothes bore some dust and light perspiration, suggesting he'd also just wrapped up a session. Though he looked tired, he appeared to be in much better shape than Han Shuo. Han Shuo forced a smile and lifted a hand in greeting. "I'm fine," he managed, though the stiffness in his movements made that seem a bold-faced lie. Cal grimaced. He'd seen enough battered bodies to suspect Han Shuo's condition was dire, even if it didn't show on his face. "This doesn't look fine at all. You're walking like your ribs are broken. Let me help you back." He moved closer, extending a supportive arm. Though grateful for the concern, Han Shuo hesitated. He belonged to the necromancy department, and was also carrying more secrets than he could comfortably explain. Having Cal escort him back might invite unwanted questions. Plus, he had a stubborn streak about owing favors. As gently as he could manage, he stepped away from Cal's steadying hand. "I appreciate it," he said softly, "but I promise I can make it on my own. I don't want to trouble you." "Really? I'll be all right if I just walk slowly." Something in Han Shuo's tone made Cal pause. With a resigned sigh, he nodded and didn't press the issue further. Just then, the sight of a familiar gold-haired figure caught Han Shuo's attention from across the training fields. Claude, accompanied by a hired human target, was heading this way. A noble smile played on his lips as he exchanged cordial greetings with other Knight students, his bearing friendly and outwardly polite. Han Shuo's heart lurched. The last time he'd encountered Claude had been in the Light Department's domain, where a deadly confrontation nearly ended both him and his little black skeleton. If it weren't for his magical yuan's uncanny defensive properties, Claude's fighting aura would have all but ripped Han Shuo apart. And though Claude had likely written the entire incident off as unimportant, Han Shuo had not forgotten. Ever since that day, he'd nursed a desire for vengeance, but he wasn't naive enough to think that he could simply take Claude on now, especially in his current badly battered state. Unfortunate timing, he thought, feeling a spike of worry. If Claude recognized him or held any grudge, Han Shuo, in his wounded condition, would be virtually defenseless. There was no chance he could outrun him. So how do I avoid him? He wondered, eyes darting around the edges of the training grounds. Claude was still a short distance away, talking and laughing with other knights, so he hadn't spotted Han Shuo yet. But the gap was closing, and each second counted if Han Shuo wanted to slip away unnoticed. Ignoring the dull roar of pain throbbing through his injured body, Han Shuo weighed his options. Should he risk trying to limp past a corner, or maybe hide behind the clustered groups of sparring students? One thing was certain, confronting Claude here and now was out of the question. Steeling himself, Han Shuo took a slow, measured breath, prepared to vanish before fate, or Claude chose a more dangerous course for him.